I just ask you first and foremost, what do you think the relationship of some of the companies that within your district is like evolving with the Pentagon? How do you observe what occurred over the last few days?
I think in Silicon Valley, there's a strong libertarian streak. And so there were many who were cheering to see Anthropic step up as it had. And look, there's a free market here, and the Defense Department has many competitors to choose from, and it has a right to choose whoever it wants. But it seems to me that at the end of the day, when we're talking about AI safeguards, these ought to be decisions that are not confined to backroom negotiations between lawyers at the Pentagon and individual companies. These ought to be very public discussions. The administration should be setting rules. Congress should be setting rules. And the way this all went down now with retribution against Anthropic and the way that Secretary Hegseth and others have articulated, I think is very damaging to Silicon Valley and, frankly, to the country.
In many ways, Anthropic and Dario Amodei have tried to make it a public discussion, brought it into the light. What's interesting is Dario has also said that the law has not yet caught up with AI's ability. Therein lies your role in Congress. How can Congress keep up at this moment to ensure that there aren't these blurred red lines that everyone's trying to digest from OpenAI's contract and from Anthropic's?
Well, this isn't the first time someone has said Congress is not moving at the pace of technology. We've been waiting 30 years for a data privacy bill, for protections against for protections for children online, et cetera. But the reality is this is an area where both Congress needs to act and the administration needs to act. There should be clear lines. I don't think a lot of folks argue with the lines that Anthropic articulated. In fact, OpenAI seemed to have embraced them. So why not, rather than punishing the company, hold these up as examples? This is an opportunity where the industry can inform the government, and we ought to be taking those cues.
You say OpenAI has embraced the red lines that Anthropic put forth. There's reporting to suggest that there's cynicism around that.
Yes, well, that is to be determined. I guess I'm simply relying on what I'm hearing publicly. Now, obviously, I understand why there might be cynicism. Look, the bottom line is this shouldn't be enforced by one particular CEO at one company. There's a reason why there ought to be a public discussion, because this is going to impact all of us, and certainly when we talk about issues like public surveillance.
I mean, realistically, are you able to have the time, the insight, the focus at the moment when we've got an erupting war with Iran and indeed, well, government shutdown? How effective can you be at this moment, Congressman?
Well, I'm not going to speak for Congress because, frankly, as you know, if you ever made a bet on Congress not getting anything done, you win 99 times out of 100.
Predictions markets are for that.
Yeah, they're doing pretty well. But I will say this week I'll be introducing a provision in what's called the Defense Productions Act, really to prevent any federal agency from retaliating against companies like Anthropic when they propose reasonable limits on the deployment of their technology. Technology is obviously a wonderful thing. We know it has enormous risks. We ought to take the cues from industry when industry tells us these risks are too great. Let's draw lines.
What do you think will be the support of that bill across both aisles?
We'll be discussing it this week in the House Financial Services Committee, where we're having a markup. I'm still having those conversations with my colleagues.
Okay, so maybe we can find some support that it shouldn't be down, there shouldn't be retribution, there shouldn't be sort of unprecedented moves where you deem a company a homegrown domestic champion as a supply risk in some way. But when you think more broadly about AI regulation in the hands of Congress or in the hands of the executive right now, are you comfortable with the amount of executive orders that have been deemed around AI, the way in which the administration has had to take maybe the steps necessary if the Congress void is still there?
Well, I know this president is not unique in using executive orders where Congress is failing to act. The way in which these executive orders have been deployed are deeply problematic, and certainly we've seen in many cases quite unconstitutional. Congress needs to step up, and that requires the majority party to do its job, that is to defend the prerogatives under Article 1 of the Constitution where Congress has authority. And we've seen a host of areas from tariffs, certainly to AI, where Congress has simply not been stepping up and allowing this president to take too much of the turf. There's a reason why we want Congress to be deciding this. These are issues that have massive impacts in many communities that are diverse, communities that are simply not benefiting from AI as much as my community in Silicon Valley might be. That's why you need to have a national conversation.
You were having a national conversation before the conversation became much more of war in the Middle East and war with Iran. You were talking about how we shouldn't see Congress just slam the brakes on AI innovation. But equally, they shouldn't accelerate. There should be a way of grabbing the steering wheel, is the way you wrote it in an op-ed. Can we get some sort of bipartisan approach to grabbing a steering wheel when you say so many states are affected in different ways by AI?
I'd like to think we can. Look, there's a lot of fears right now around AI, around loss of jobs, around impacts on utility bills. There are opportunities for us to move together. For example, we know these hyperscalers need speed. Let's give them federal permits, enable them to accelerate if they're keeping ratepayers whole and protecting them from these utility, the risk of higher prices on their utility bills, and investing in batteries and the kinds of technology we know that will be sustainable rather than simply pulling more natural gas and coal in. For example, on jobs, there are things that we can do that are bipartisan that can incentivize companies to invest in community colleges and local state universities to upskill and reskill. These are not necessarily partisan notions. This is a time for us to be thinking more creatively across the aisle on these kinds of solutions. We don't have the kind of administration now in office that is particularly bipartisan, and so it's really going to have to come from ground up.
You mentioned social media. And I think in many ways, people have felt that there's been a void of lawmaking around social media because there is so much nuance to much of this. Is there sometimes too much nuance when it comes to the likes of impact by the Pentagon's decisions on mass surveillance, on issues of autonomous weaponry, that really laws can't be made that can keep up briefly?
It's fair to say that this is incredibly complex, and you can't simply declare amateur hour and start to announce edicts that are going to apply broadly across multiple industries where the impacts may be very different. What I have been proposing, and we'll be coming out with legislation soon, is how, for example, on AI, we can essentially enable industry experts, academic experts, to be able to establish what those best practices are in an industry, allow industry to reach those best practices rather than having some kind of monolithic edict come from Congress or the administration. Government's not going to get it right. We have to acknowledge that. This is moving too fast. We need to rely on the best thinking in the industry to establish what the best practices are and then mandate that if folks can reach those, they can have the benefits, for example, of preemption. And if they don't, then they're subjected to the edicts of 50 different states.